Pam's work is well known, um, particularly in her long-standing research in Indonesia, um, and her recent work in particular around Muslim youth identity and masculinities and violence and stuff like that. So the lecture is split up into five parts, just briefly introducing the idea of global youth, and then there'll be kind of three small case studies of Pam's work on Indonesian youth, popular culture and religion, on space, time, symbol and urban Indonesian schoolboy gangs. And then part 4 will be about some work that Pam and I did in Bali around young people being recruited into the cruise ship industry. And the lecture will conclude with Pam's most recent work, which is in a forthcoming book about Muslim youth identity. So now I'd just like to hand it over to Pam, and she can talk about her work. Thanks, Pam.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yes, well, I'll start off by talking about global youth. A number of years ago, I wrote a book with my colleague, edited a book with my colleague Carles Feixar from Spain, which had a particular focus on global youth. I guess when we talk about global youth, we realise that many claims are made that youth are now completely global, that they live in a globalised world, that they no longer have any particular local cultural points of reference, but might, for example, act like Black American youth in the ghetto, or want to dress up like Chinese manga stars or something of that kind, and that this means the end of individual local cultures. However, I guess Kailash and I, both because he researches in South America and I research in Indonesia, are both very dubious about this, because when we go to those places, we find very distinctive local youth cultures that don't look like exactly what's happening in every other part of the world. So when we wrote that book, we set out to show how local these apparently global subcultures actually were. And yeah, I think the point is that to be sociological about it, youth are certainly involved now in what we call the network society, which puts them in touch with a whole lot of global ideas. And in gaming, for example, which I'm looking at for my Muslim youth studies at the moment, by gaming they can actually fall into relationships and even friendships with people all over the world as they play games like World of Warcraft or Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, or any of those kinds of games. So yes, they are global, but they are also local. And it takes it back really to the ontological security that Giddens identified, which was brought about by rapid social change, which encourages young people towards kinds of self-invention where they, well, I've said it several times in lectures, they cover as many bases as possible. So they have a legitimacy within global youth culture, and they also have a legitimacy within local cultural norms, and this makes them very ontologically secure. We also describe this a bit using the term mobility capital or mobility networking, so that they're moving around in hyperspace, really, in hyperreality, in virtual space, but they are actually located where they are. And like all young people, they probably spend more time talking to young people that they know locally than they do to people on the other side of the world. So even socially, they're fairly well located in relationship to their own social groups.
So you started in the Global Youth book using the idea of hybridity.
Yes, we did.
But then your work has kind of started to critically engage with that idea itself, hasn't it?
Yes, well, we use the term hybrid with a question mark actually in the title of the work because we knew it would appeal. It was what was used a lot at the time, and we thought we would just use it and then internally critique it. There wasn't really room in the book to critique it, so I'm more critical of it than Kailash is. And subsequently I wrote about why I don't like the term hybridity, because it presupposes two things not mixed equally. Yep. Its original meaning of the term is that these two things or three things are not equal.
Yep.
And hybridity is actually a binary term. It only means really two things. It doesn't mean, if you want to create... From biology. It comes from biology, that there was in Gregor Mendel's work with bean plants, that there was a recessive gene and a dominant gene, and you could make a hybrid through emphasising what was in the recessive or the subordinate gene. So the idea of superiority, inferiority, is really built into the idea of hybridity, and that's why it used so much about the combination of, say, a minority in the global south type culture blended with a majority cultural norm from the global north, say from the US.
Yeah.
And therefore that makes a hybrid culture, but it's always, in a way, it's always got that idea of the superior term somewhere in there, and I don't like that. I think
so. The notion of hybrid, in that sense, kind of implicit when used about cultures, almost has a kind of colonial
it
aspect
has.
to it.
I think it's another colonial term. I think it really suffers from a bad case of colonialism, and I prefer things like synthesis, mixing, assemblage, and those kinds of terms.
So assemblage is the Deleuzian term, and that was introduced in Julia's lecture about the body in week 9. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to have to hurry up a bit, or I'm not going to really get
there.
It's
fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just move through the lecture.
The thing that we said in the book, and which I've also put in the lecture materials that you have, is that the global teenager is used all the time as a marketing term, and the global youth market is constantly. So to some extent, the idea of global youth is built up from within a capitalist framework to make as much profit as possible, so that things can be basically sold off or marketed to groups of young people who believe that by drinking Coca-Cola, wearing Nike, Calvin Klein, and some of the designer brands, that they instantly become global youth, that they have a legitimacy within global youth culture, which is very attractive to them. And this goes right down to the level of local bands doing cover songs, you know, in places like Africa, and you know, the huge growth of reggae all over the world. Also has that kind of colonialist idea.
It's also like, you know, when, you know, say westernized cultural texts are consumed in those places, they're actually often consumed in very different ways than we might imagine. I remember you told me once about when you went to Indonesia and Friends was really popular.
No, Friends was not really popular.
No,
Friends, in fact, was not popular at all because no one had anywhere to put it.
Right. Okay.
Theoretically. What was really popular was Xena the Warrior Princess.
Ah, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That was really popular because it connects with a whole lot of folk tales and things that are on Indonesian television all the time. Friends didn't make any sense because groups of young unmarried people do not live together in any sort of close sense like that. That's a very opposite from the way youth culture runs in Indonesia.
Okay.
So in Friends was not popular and made no sense, and nobody could really relate to it.
So the texts themselves kind of get recontextualized for their own local meanings, even though these global texts become. So that's what I'm kind of talking about here. They're not hybrid in that sense. They're actually reused and reconfigured by the locals for their own use.
They are. I mean, somebody once gave the wonderful example of a group of teenagers up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea with a television rigged up to a car battery, and they were watching old reruns of the A-Team. And Mr. T, who many of you will remember was a character in the A-Team, was like a supernatural chief type figure that they all merely related to, and his powers were thought to be magical. So they were reading him through a different cultural lens altogether. He was very popular, as he was in the West at the time too. But it wasn't the same way of reading.
It's funny that, like I say, there's a certain irony there that they were watching the TV hooked up to a car battery, which sounds exactly something like the A-Team would do. But anyway.
Well, maybe.
Okay, so now we'll move on to this specific study that you did, the Indonesian youth, popular culture and religion.
Yes.
So do you want to just tell us a little bit about, to begin with, so starting off with this photo here. And
which is all, that one's mangled.
Yeah, I wonder what was going on there. Yeah, okay.
I don't know why that's mangled. That was originally a photograph of me and one of my young informants.
Okay.
And
Still can't see it there.
And this is a piece of graffiti that I also took,
Yep.
Which only makes sense if you absolutely know what the cultural references are inside it.
Yep.
I've been working in Indonesia for a long time, and I've always researched youth.
Yep. And you speak Indonesian as
well?
I
speak Indonesian, yes, I do. So I talk to young people. I don't speak what they speak necessarily. They speak a particular kind of youth speak called Bahasa Gaul, and I can understand it, but I can't use it much myself.
Yep.
But anyway, I do talk to them, and they talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came to understand Indonesian youth as, well, they're predominantly Muslim. I do most of my work in Muslim Indonesia. And most of the time when I'm there, I don't think about them as being Muslim, not because they're not Muslim, but because when everybody around you is a Muslim, you stop thinking about, they're Muslim. You don't think about it that way. They're very modern in all of their ways, regardless of whether they pray 5 times a day and wear the headscarf and, carry around a Quran or whatever, or have Arabic tones or on their phones or whatever. They're intensely modern, and they take themselves to be very modern young Muslims in the world. And although in Australia and in places like Australia we don't think about that, there's literally millions and millions and millions of trendy young Muslims out there in the world right now who are very modern and very cutting edge in how they see the world and their particular worldview. So I did some work on gender and the things that they were watching, the things that they were listening to, their kind of social practices that they remaining within the moral order of Islam. How do they do it? How do they manage to find people to marry that they liked and weren't in arranged marriages? How did they manage to go to pop concerts and listen to music and do crazy things in their bedroom and upload them to YouTube and all the other things that they were habitually doing while absolutely remaining within the moral order of Islam?
Okay.
So this became something that I got very interested in.
Yep. So tell me about the idea of the heterotopia here.
The heterotopia of the internet cafe.
The cafe itself.
And the shopping mall.
Yeah.
I need to think. Did I put anything in that slide about the heterotopia? Well, anyway, heterotopia, I'll just have to do it off the top of my head. Foucault introduced the idea of the heterotopia. And a heterotopia is not a place in which anything can happen, but it's one in which the emergent possibilities have to do with various forms of pleasure that are created. And the heterotopia is an open, mirroring kind of space where actions are repeated or actions are mirrored in the possibility of pleasure. And so they're heterotopias because lots of different things go on inside them, but they don't take place in an absolutely free play of meaning and action. They're heterotopias because they're like a set of a kaleidoscope of mirrors or a hall of mirrors that reflect particular kinds of orders within the heterotopia that appears at first to be highly divergent and lots of different things going on in there. But once you look deeper, you realise that they are in a kind of the mirror can keep reflecting forever.
And so you used that idea to think about the spaces of the internet cafe and the shopping mall as a kind of space to do ethnography in.
It's a space to do ethnography in and a space for them to explore their own particular kinds of youth culture meanings. And so I was intent on sort of having a look at what happened in the internet cafe and the shopping mall because they were instructive spaces for me to understand what it was that they were doing socially.
Okay. So there's some information about the methodology there. So tell me about what
I started off looking at gender because it's not done for young people. These were fairly mid-teens to early teens to later teens. And first of all, boys are permitted far greater freedom than girls because it's feared girls will engage in premarital sex, which in the two major religions, Christianity is also very strong in Indonesia and it is just as moralistic on the topic of premarital sex. So there's not much difference there actually. But in a place like Java, which is where I was doing my research, there's also a very informal hanging around. Javanese people tell a lot of jokes, they laugh a lot, they shriek and laugh and carry on and call out stuff to each other in a very informal way when they're in the village and in the kampung. And so Javanese youth talk about this as nongkrong, which means to hang around really with your friends and talk and laugh. And the most normal way of young Indonesians socialising, certainly in the city of Solo where I was doing my research, was for single-sex groups to kind of cruise by one another on a fairly frequent basis in places like the shopping malls, the markets, at an open-air festival, which go on a lot, even really at certain sorts of religious festivals, not religious services so much as religious festivals, which do go on. But the shopping mall has become the kind of new arena for this kind of practice to take place. And so I got quite interested in the way, I would study them for hours, the way groups of young people moved around the shopping malls. And there's some detailed ethnographic work that I did on that about what they did and where they went and who they were texting. Mobile phones have, of course, made this even more glorious, you know, really, because you can be completely ignoring somebody and because you're texting,
makes the social interaction
makes a social
complex,
interaction happen. And so, as I said, in using Giddens, it was the binding of the time, the structure, and the space. And in shopping malls, this is a moral order. So you go there at specific times when it's morally okay to go there.
Yep.
And that's after prayers on, on Friday evening, and certainly same time of day on Saturday are very popular times. Whole families go, and then the young people all leave their family. A lot of young people leave their families and go off with their school groups, but as long as they don't mix with boys or mix with girls, nobody worries about them.
Okay.
But at the same time, they're constantly checking each other out.
Yep.
And what they call tepe tepe, which is tabara persona, which means to spread charm without apparently looking at something. It's a highly refined kind of, to walk by somebody and let them know with your body language that you're looking at them, but you're not looking at them. And you know that they know that they are looking at you.
Yep.
But in fact, it's highly complex.
Yep. I'm interested in terms of the public space aspect there. So in Australia, when groups of young people hang around in shopping malls, they're seen as loitering and asked to move on if they're not spending money. Does that the kind of same thing happen in spaces?
Well, no, and I have pondered that long and hard. I do think that when groups of young people often go to the shopping mall with family members, and family members and older family members often accompany them, the girls in particular, to make sure that they're going to be all right. But they don't want to walk around with a whole group of girls all the time, because sometimes they're older males or something like that. So they spend money.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So the attraction of groups of young people, because of the fact that there's lots of people there, they will buy something to eat or a hair clip, or the boys will buy a magazine or something very cheap, perhaps. Sometimes, but not always.
Consume legitimately.
Yeah, to consume legitimately, especially when they're waiting to break the fast after Ramadan. So they all eat there, you see. So they often put a rock band on downstairs, doing religious rock, Muslim style. So the young people go there because when you break the fast, everyone eats so much after they break the fast. In fact, most of the Indonesians I know put on weight during Ramadan because of the absolute feasting that goes on, but when they're not in the fast.
Okay, well, we might move on now to some of the scenes you've kind of set out in the next 4 slides. We probably won't have time to go through all of them, but here in these slides you've kind of set out from 3 p.m. through to 9 p.m. the observation on one particular day. So do you just want to summarise
the
that
Internet
for us?
Cafe. The Internet Cafe, when I did my fieldwork there years ago, there was very bad internet connections everywhere in the town. So I used to go to the Internet Cafe to send my emails. The longer emails, I could manage the short ones, but anything if I wanted to send a document. So I started going to this particular Internet Cafe, which was near a number of schools, Muslim, Christian and secular schools. And I realised that at 3 p.m. every day, this vast number of students from all 3 schools that were nearby, high schools, early junior high, would pour into the place. And I started watching them and observing, not idiosyncratically and who they were specifically, but just the patterns of where they went, what they did. And they would just all stay in their single-sex groups. They would be looking up video clips, and they would be texting, and the boys and the girls would be playing games online. And they would be checking emails, and they would be sending emails and texting, and there was a lot of sort of low-level flirting going across the room in the same way as in the mall. They would not do eye contact, but there would be particular giggling. And
so that sounds like a similar scene would be happening in Newcastle, Sydney in a similar space. So what's different in terms of...
Because there were no couples.
Right.
And I mean, if you go into early teens even, you'll see boys and girls together. I mean, a lot of kids will still be single sex because they don't mix very readily at that point because it's giving the wrong signal or something. But you also see couples. You never see couples at that age. They're not really allowed to go about holding hands or doing anything like that. So they kind of do it virtually, as it were. It's not just like it's not going on. And the Indonesians use the term cinta monyet, which means monkey love, which means that they're just playing.
Right. Okay.
It's just play love.
So
play
flirting
romance.
and body language and social relations through those
And
mediums.
ha ha ha, he just dropped me, whereas they've never had any physical contact or even spoken to each other,
Okay.
It's kind of goes on.
Okay. And does what happens in the space change throughout the day?
The space change. Slide. 5 p.m. 5 p.m. The junior high school kids have gone by 5 p.m. They're
Yep.
not out after hours, and it gets dark quite early in Indonesia because it's a tropical country.
Yep.
So by about 5 p.m., 6 p.m., university students, at this stage there was very little internet access on campus, which is why everyone would go to these internet
Yep.
cafes, which is why they were such a good source of
Yep.
ethnographic detail. And so uni students would come in, young activists, people looking for stuff for their homework.
Mm-hmm.
Who didn't have internet access at home, and not that many families in Solo had it at this time, private
Yep.
access at home. And so it was full of older young people, and they would be more likely to be in mixed groups by this stage.
Yep.
But often they were just groups of friends, like the example I give in the slide of the girl who I was talking to. I think there were 3 girls and 2 boys in that group, and they were all clustered around the same
computer
terminal.
Yep. And kind of interacting through whatever they were doing on
They
that.
were interacting not in we're doing something naughty because we're all hanging out. The girls all wear headscarves, and the boys were obviously fairly devout, but they were busy with a piece of social activism.
Yep.
And so that was the rationale.
Yep.
Boys and girls also mix in Scouts. Scouts is very popular in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And although there's some segregation of the sexes, when they all go off on a kind of trek or a picnic or to go to do some work reclamation on sand dunes or something, they all work together.
Okay.
And so there's a number of different situations in which even young teens can actually hang out with people of the opposite sex.
Yep.
But not in the mall.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Or the internet cafe.
Yeah, so not in broader public space, but more in organised, supervised.
If an event is
conditions.
organised of that kind,
Yeah.
So by 9 p.m, the internet cafe has been taken over mainly by men and by couples who are obviously in a relationship with each other or courting couples or something like that.
So not really young people left in the space, and it's more adults.
No. And
late 20s.
It seemed to me, because I was walking around and being a bit nosy, that what they were doing on the computers was now completely different. It wasn't sort of looking up film clips and emailing friends and giggling and carrying on and pulling up funny things of cats falling, cats in baskets and all that kind of stuff that teens do. It was more porn and gambling.
Okay.
And more serious video games.
Yeah. So just like an aside here in terms of methodologies that we use to do research, I think just observing one space over a period of time is really interesting in terms of what happens in social relations. So I suppose in a lot of ways most ethnographies kind of participate with the same people and go to different spaces with them in a lot of cases where just focusing what happens in one space like this it can really illuminate the different social relations and the way people react with each other and just kind of what goes on at different times.
Yes, it can.
Really interesting,
In the internet cafe, I didn't have key informants. In the mall, I had key informants, kids I knew from who I saw at uni every day and who would come and talk to me, and I had several of them. In fact, the photograph that you can't see is with one of them. That was a rock band.
Okay. So that's just a photo there of the religious rock band that was at the mall?
Yeah, and usually those guys don't wear those sort of clothes. They're only wearing it because it's Ramadan.
Okay.
And usually they just play straight rock, as it were. And on this occasion, they're doing covers of some of the big Muslim bands like Snada.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second example here we've got is when you're in the mall. It's like a different space.
Yeah.
You want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, there's a specific form of socialising called ngebuburit, which is in Solo. It's a very Javanese word. It's not Indonesian. And it means hanging around with one's friends while waiting for the fast to end.
Right.
Usually on a Friday or a Saturday during Ramadan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because people get bored, with being hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the hour or so leading up to when, usually the end of Ramadan is signalled by the imam or the studs or whatever, banging a big cymbal. Or sometimes they do that as an amplified sound, it's electronic. But anyway, it's like boom, and everybody, then the fast is over, and the sun is setting, the fast is over, and everyone can eat. And usually they break the fast with a drink first, because the body hasn't had any fluids or any food since dawn, which is about 5 o'clock in the morning. So they will start off with fluids.
So what time of night is this when the sun sets?
Oh, I don't know. Let's track of time a bit. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, something like that.
Mm.
Yeah. It's called Badug. On days when it's very cloudy, it can be a bit later, a bit early, so it's not always exactly at the same time, but mostly that's when. And so this data was all collected during Ramadan, which I found to be very interesting. I thought everything could be as dull as anything and nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
Everyone was totally hyped and full of it. And
Yep.
yeah.
And so in the mall, you said you had key informants. So rather than
Yes.
just observing here, you were actually talking to people as well.
Yes, I was
Yep.
actually talking to people.
Okay.
There's somebody here I was talking. There's somebody in this data that I was a key informant. It wasn't Raras. It was one
Yep.
of the others.
Um,
No, I don't think I put the key informants into this data,
Okay.
but I had certain key informants
Yep.
who I would always sit with.
Yep.
And they'd come up and they use the excuse of, oh, we want to practice our English with you.
Yep.
And that would last about 5 minutes
Yep.
methodologically, and then we would go into Indonesian.
Okay.
And if they were speaking really rapid Indonesian, sometimes I would get them to write things down. I had a pad with me. And if I couldn't get what they were saying,
Yep. Yep.
I'd say, well, write down what, because when they're all talking at once, because
Yeah.
I'm not a native speaker, it can get very, very hard. And I wasn't recording it.
No.
This is real ethnography in the
Yep.
sense that I had to write big notes
Take
afterwards.
notes, yeah.
Yeah. So these notes are all written afterwards.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll leave
Yeah, leave that.
leave that there and we'll get to the conclusion of this and then move on to the next section. So just kind of leave these notes here of Pam's observations and what was actually going on in the mall in these spaces. But to kind of sum up this section, what were the conclusions of this?
Well,
case
this came
study?
out of a big study that I did, which was funded by AusAid, which doesn't exist anymore. But Alex Broom and I got that grant, and he did India and I did Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And so because I'm interested in youth, I decided to do gangs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very hard to get access because I'm older. I'm not Indonesian. I'm a woman.
Yep.
It was really hard to get to crime gangs.
Yep.
So I started looking at young boys gangs.
Yep.
And that was much easier to get data about that. So I started looking at schoolboy gangs and what they did and how they operated.
Yep.
And my key informant here was Hatib Kadir, and he's a researcher, but he's also been involved in himself as a Christian youth. Yeah. Yep. And so he gave me a lot of information about space, time and symbol. There's a big punk movement. I've got a picture of punks. There's a huge punk movement in Indonesia, and punks are very... they look like they just live on the street, but they're actually not street kids. They actually have homes to go to.
Yep.
The real street kids don't look like that.
Yep. Yep.
But really, I was looking at schoolboy gangs. Schoolboy fighting is a huge problem in Indonesia, and there's numerous deaths every year from it.
Right.
It's like hazing. It's like this big kind of ritual among boys that goes on. And schools have particular rivalries. So say you'll have a state school A and state school B that are about 10k away from each other. They will have a huge traditional established rivalry, established over 50 years sometimes.
Yep.
So those groups of boys always fight each other.
And do they have specific space?
Yes, they do.
That's each other's territory?
Yes.
Again, so this again relates to what Alistair was talking about last week. It seems that no matter where the gang kind of stuff happening, there's actually often very similar things, regardless of cultures and religions.
Yes.
That
it's true. It's true.
When
I looked at the gang stuff coming out of the US and Virgil's stuff on gangs and Hagendorf and people like that, who Alistair also uses, it was pretty obvious that there are territories. So there's a kind of with the boys' schools, there was often a neutral territory in the middle where they would fight. And then incursions onto what was regarded as their own territory, which is the areas near the school, were the grounds for a retaliatory attack of some kind.
Okay. So this research was done in 2 different trips, was it? Or just one trip?
No,
okay.
2 different trips.
Okay. So some of your findings here relate the kind of masculinity going on in these things.
It's very much a rite of masculinity.
Heroic kind of narratives,
Yeah. But I don't wish to give the impression that all the boys in the schools were involved in it. It was just a particular group of boys.
Yep. Okay.
The tough boys, basically.
Okay. So do you want to just take us through some of these observations here?
Well, to a large extent, the worst fighting does not take place between kids from the best schools. Let's just leave the best schools out of it, whether they're Muslim schools, Christian schools, or secular schools. Let's just leave them out of it, because that's not where it happens. It happens right down at the lowest levels, like the cheapest, if you like, in terms of fees, Muslim schools, the Catholic, some of the really cheap Catholic schools, but not normally, because there are only a few Catholic schools, and they're usually pretty expensive Christian schools, and the less preferred government schools, and we know that happens in Australia too. And the tech schools, they have tech schools over there, and the tech rivalries between the poorest of the Muslim schools, the tech schools, and the lowest status public school, high schools are the ones where the fighting really takes place. So it's very much class
Yep.
And I went back, not in what I presented here, to Willis's Learning to Labour,
Yeah.
looking at a class analysis of masculinity in class,
Yep.
and using Messerschmitt's idea that Messerschmitt had this concept that when other aspects of working class masculinity cannot be readily supplied, like of getting a job, of being rich, of having the right motorbike if you're in Indonesia,
Yep.
or whatever else, that there are other ways of achieving status, and fighting and gangs and offers legitimacy, it offers membership, it offers loyal companions,
Yep.
it offers excitement, it offers thrills.
Mm-hmm.
So an exciting, deviant career, as I say there, in a school is compelling and thrilling.
Yep.
And the boys take pleasure in planning strategies, running with the gang, being victorious. They tell the stories all the time. The stories grow in the telling.
Yep.
You can be a hero
Yep.
in this deviant career of being a gang member.
Yep. Yep.
So this is very much also what Alistair talks about.
It does, yeah. So Alistair, we were talking about this last week, and we briefly introduced the ideas of the Chicago School, the notions of status frustration, and how property damage and violence can actually be a result of that kind of stuff. And we can also think about this in Borgerian terms, who's been a key theorist in the course, that these are struggles over forms of capital,
they are.
Not kind of high status cultural capital, but
Yeah.
kind of subcultural forms of capital within this kind of field of of masculine relations and gangs and stuff like that.
In terms of physical capital, what I didn't play up here is within this field, the form of physical capacity that it signifies physical capital is not so much physical strength, but actually martial arts.
Right. Okay.
Because martial arts is vast in Indonesia.
Yep.
Many, many forms, including indigenous local forms of martial arts. And many of the boys study this on the slide.
Mm-hmm.
They also practice magic,
because
magic is a big part of, even though I know it's a Muslim country, but you would not believe how much magic is still believed in.
Yep.
And they have certain implants under the skin that give them, almost supernatural powers. They wear particular kinds of rings with stones in them that are supposed to surround the wearer with an aura of protection and give them supernatural power. So there's a lot going on in these gangs.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And in terms of, I used Honor there, recognition as an important heuristic for understanding how feelings of justice and inferiority can lead to conflict and civil unrest. Because it is really about, what happens with violence, how does it come about, how come, people go through their life. As well as the boys who are actually doing the fighting, it must be said that there's a vast group of other boys. I don't know if you remember, Steve, but when you're at school, certainly school I went to, fight on the oval, right? And the whole school would flock down there. So these are just the same, So there's a whole lot of kids who follow the action without actually getting involved in it.
It's important, I suppose, not to kind of make this look like some kind of radical violence. No. It's actually day-to-day violence that happens. It's day-to-day violence. It happens in most,
well, not all, but some.
Okay. So you also kind of associated this with notions of, the warrior culture and stuff like that. Yeah, the warrior
culture. It's Indonesia's got big warrior culture, as they do in Japan too. It's probably the best example of it. And also in India, this idea of the sacred warrior is very, very important. And
this is what this graffiti represents.
It also is in Islam as well. Well, that's actually Satan. That's the devil.
Right.
But it's a kind of a glamorous image. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's the Mahabharata, which is the Java was Hindu, Buddhist for many centuries, and that still lingers on in the folk tales and the mythology.
Right.
However, it's also the sacred warrior is very important in Islam as well. And so there's a kind of an overlap.
Resonances with those two different things.
I was surprised by how similar the initiation rituals were to the stuff that Vigil and Hagedorn talk about in the US.
Okay.
There's a very strong sort of idea of the blooding of the warrior.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, I've been emphasising in the course the notion of struggle, and this in some ways are both symbolic struggles, but they're also manifest in physical struggles. Over in very similar ways that Alice was talking last week about space and ideas of status and things like that.
Yes. I guess what was most intriguing for me about this was, for many of the stuff that Alistair does, and Kailesh also does gang stuff. He does the Latin kings and queens. That this doesn't, in Indonesia, it only happens in the field of school. It's like it stops. The day you walk out of school, you don't do it anymore, ever.
Okay.
there's no really comparable.
Okay. So what do they do then?
Well, most of them, if they've got a job and they're basically sort of, respectable, well-class boys who've just been having a bit of a naughty time while they're at school, they just go off and get jobs.
Yep.
There's a small proportion who join motorcycle gangs or standover gangs, or what are called preman, which is kind of thug protection racket type stuff.
But for the most part, this is just kind of a rites of passage.
This is a rites of passage.
Growing up,
that has all those things I just mentioned have a completely different meaning in different fields.
Yeah.
So it's like none of these groups really go past high school.
Okay. Yep.
So it's a struggle within that particular field and only within that particular field.
Yep.
And it's taken up with the sort of Javanese ideas of adulthood and being a child.
Yep.
So when you become an adult male, your point is to become as quiet and composed, and the hidden menace thing is very, very big.
Yep.
Right? It's not being all emotional.
Yep.
And rushing about and yelling at people and hitting them with sharpened rulers and all that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I'm just seeing how we go with time here. So we've kind of discussed some of this stuff already. Do you want to tell me a little bit what's going on in this photo?
This photo was taken after a fight.
Yep.
And the guy in the
everyone's
back...
getting out of there?
No, a whole lot of... The guy you can see in the blue shirt with a cap is actually, he's a paramedic.
Right, okay. Yep.
But this guy had just been fighting.
Right. Yep. And what happened in that?
Well, he had been fighting, but his claim was he had been defending himself.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So he wasn't one of the ones who were run away. He said we were just coming home from school and we were attacked.
So do the police get involved in these kind of things?
Yeah, the police are there. Yeah. You can't actually see the police at the moment. There's various teachers and there's all... I just happened upon this on the street, literally.
Yep.
Whipped out the old camera.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Right, well, I might move through and I'll get you to sum up, because we've spoken about all this other stuff on those slides. I'll just get you to sum up about what your kind of conclusions are from that project.
Well, there's a couple of conclusions out of that project. One of them is about masculinity and gender as it's constructed.
Yep.
And this kind of notion of that particular kind of masculinity, that the young male body is highly emotional. And it's sort of seen differently. It's like because of the inner world and the outer world in the Javanese sort of understanding of self, it's like the emotions can rush up through the young man and overwhelm him, and then he becomes like amok. Have you ever heard that concept? That comes out of Indonesia.
Right.
Running amok.
Yeah, okay.
It's a concept of amok. It's actually amok.
Yep.
It's like the berserker in the Scandinavian warrior stuff.
Yep.
And you kind of grow out of that in Indonesia.
Okay.
To be an adult male is not to be like that.
Yep.
It's a sign of having, so that your inner and outer is in balance, because you come through puberty. It's usually signaled by getting married.
Right. Okay.
Getting married, and particularly becoming a father.
Yep. So that those markers are kind of when you move beyond the kind of strum and drang kind of.
Yes, that's right. Very much that. Yeah.
So in terms of in general youth studies, in the West, we're discovering, and it's to the norm now, where those markers of adulthood, such as getting a full-time job, getting married, getting your own place to live, are happening later and later and later.
Yeah.
Is that the case in a place like Indonesia?
Some of those things happen younger than they do in the West.
Yep.
Like young men and women get married earlier.
Yep.
They have children earlier. They may take longer to move into a full-time job, and they may take a very long time to move out of mum and dad's place.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So those markers kind of, again, they're blurry, but not probably as detraditionalised as they are here.
No, they're not detraditionalised, and young men and women remain very much within their families.
Yep.
In a way that they don't. That's why our earlier conversation about friends didn't make any sense.
Yep.
It was a world that really doesn't exist.
Yep. Okay. Right. And what's this?
That I got. That was after his guy on the ground's dead.
Yep.
And he's been killed as a result of that fight.
Right.
And that other guy, the guy that's standing up, is just a rickshaw driver who came over to have a look. Okay. That's the police. That's a detective in the background.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't take that photograph.
No. Yeah.
It was the outcome of a schoolboy struggle,
Yep.
a schoolboy fight in Jakarta,
Yep.
in which there were a number of deaths. I think there were 15 people killed that day.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is certainly, a little bit more
You
beyond
can't
the
see it,
day-to-day
but he'd been
struggles.
stabbed.
Yeah. You can see the blood. Yeah. Okay. Righto. So let's move on to the kind of second last case study, and this is work that we did in Bali a few years ago now, quite a few years ago now, and essentially we went over there, and you'd done this beforehand. So the way this research happened is that Pam had noticed this kind of new recruitment of Balinese young people into the global cruise ship industry, kind of in the early 2000s, really.
Well, it's really pointed out to be our third collaborator on this, by Artini, who I've known for many years. She's a very old friend.
Who actually did a PhD here.
Yeah, she did her PhD at the University of Newcastle, but I knew her before that. And we often talk about new trends among young people because we've both got kids and we're interested in stuff.
I'll come back to
and
that
she told me about this trend for young people who were very promising at high school, but they chose not to go to university, even though they could have got in. They went and signed themselves up to these cruise ship training companies and training courses, which were very expensive and put the whole family in debt. So they could go and work on cruise ships, and that was really the impetus for this. For this study.
And these observations first happened after the 2002, what we call here the Balinese bombings.
The Bali bombings,
when
because
tourism got kind of decimated, and there was even quite middle-class privileged kids were going into this. By the time we started doing the research, though, it seemed to be that tourism had recovered and there was more kind of disadvantaged kids going into
That's exactly right. Yeah, you're right, Steve. That's exactly the trend that happened. Certainly when I first started to look at it, even the wealthier kids
we're doing it.
We're doing it, and
so in the work we did around this, we found there's quite a bit of literature out there that studies the cruise ship industry at a kind of broader level. People talk about it as kind of an almost symbolic globalization on sea, where the ships, are kind of white rich people on the top levels, and it kind of gets more down kind of to the developed world as you get below. Ari describes them as floating gated communities. So the stuff that Pam found, and then the stuff that we did interviews with later on, we found that the children, the recruitment agencies actually go into schools and recruit. They set up training centres, all over the place. Kids are recruited for various, specific reasons of, having good communication skills, not being too religious. Often, helpfully if you can kind of dance and stuff like that as well. And cooking skills has become increasingly a thing there too. Now what we found, which was, I suppose, somewhat challenging, is that the students were going into lots of debt to do this. So they were paying thousands of dollars to get trained up for a year or two, about a year normally. Then they'd have to pay thousands of dollars to a recruitment agency to get them a job. And then they'd often have to then pay another couple of $1,000s to leave Bali to go to a port somewhere to get on the boats, because the boats don't come to Bali. So we were working out that sometimes they were like, was it $8,000 to $10,000 Australian in debt before they even started. Now the wages they were collecting on board were probably slightly more than they would get at home, working in the tourism industry or something like that. But by the time, they paid back that initial debt, was often a couple of years at least before they could pay it back. So the way the work would actually be done in practice is they would sign contracts every year. The contracts were 9 to 10 months. They'd come home for a couple of months, but normally they were signing multiple contracts over years to do this research. And often, as I said, not only paying back the debt that they were accrued to get the training, but also subsidising and sending remittances back to family and stuff like that.
The majority were male, and there were girls who did it, but it was particularly disadvantaged, we found, in terms of getting married and having children and family formation. And there was many jokes go in Bali about, oh, he works on the cruise ship. Okay, which one of the kids is his? This kind of idea that spending so much time away in the remittances. In many other countries of the world, it's women who send home remittances. With the cruise ship thing, it tends to be men who are on the cruise ships, especially young men, who are either sending remittances home to their families or remittances back to wife or something like that. And often they don't get paid till the end of the cruise.
Yeah.
So this means the wife lives in poverty for all that time, and then she gets a lot of money.
Yep.
And so particular money management things have to be took in place. But I think there's some stuff in the case studies about how long it took to build up the money to buy a business or to create a business.
So the research we did when I went, I can't remember what year it was, but we found that we went to 2 different training centres and we did focus groups with the trainees there. One was a kind of weird focus group where there was about 15 trainees there. We spoke to them, and then we did another one where there was about 6 or 8. We also interviewed a couple of people that were working on cruise ships at the time, young people, 2 or 3 guys that were doing that. And then the last thing we did was with a couple of 40-year-old guys who'd done it for about 15 or 20 years and had finished doing it and had set up their own restaurant based on those skills and reputational stuff that kind of... So it's interesting in some respects. Like, you think about this as a kind of, it's hard not to think about this as some kind of form of global exploitation, where people are being kind of brought into this industry. They're horribly exploited in all kinds of ways, but then some of them, at least, it kind of pays off in the future, doesn't it?
Yeah,
they set up their own
it
businesses.
does, but it can take them a very, very, very long time. And one of the guys we interviewed right at the end said that even though he'd sworn he would never go back to cruise ships, because we haven't mentioned how hard the work is,
we'll get to that in a
how
second.
difficult it is. He said he would never go back, but he was going back just for one more time because there was some family issue where they needed money, and he could get a lot of money because he was quite senior. They go up in seniority as they spend money. So there is a possibility of promotion, but they can never go high. They can never become... No. Because it's a very segmented workforce. So the Asian workers and the cruise ship companies don't like black workers. They don't like Chinese workers. They like people from the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia. And they do have some Indian people, but really their preference is for that.
It's really quite obvious, They don't even try to hide it.
No, they don't even try to hide it. But you can't make your way up. All the so a purser or the steward or something, the head steward, are all white. It's a very race segregated labour market.
It's kind of against colonialism.
You can become a senior assistant chef, and one of the guys that actually made it into chef. But chef is behind the scenes. But most of the chefs are actually white. So he was one of the few that ever made it.
So I'll just go back to this. This is a photo that I took of a poster that was in the training centre. So, for the 16 to 17-year-old kids, or even slightly younger, that were kind of in these training centres, this is the kind of image they were being sold, that they could travel the world, see the world, And in some respects, they were getting small opportunities to do that. So they'd go on, these cruises that go for a couple of weeks, and they'd get 2 days off where they could get out at a port and maybe go out and do something with their mates. But for the most part, they were working 12-hour days at least. They were telling us stories like, one of them told us stories that they were feeding themselves with leftovers off the passengers' plates, that they were having to pay to wash their own clothes and all kinds of stuff like that. So there was, quite obviously really kind of full-on stuff going on. One of the other interesting things was in terms of the social relations between the passengers and the crew. So you can see a few quotes there that not only was some of the stuff that was going on in the boat really hard for the workers, that also some of the passengers often felt ripped off because they felt they were paying for services they weren't getting. The food was pretty crappy, and then this was, engendering situations that weren't nice for anyone.
The other thing that we stressed in that was that cruise ships, because they cruise in open sea, are not covered by the International Labour Organisation regulations about the treatment of workers, and they are registered as ships in places like the Bahamas, which have very lax ideas about what you can and can't do. So the International Labour Organisation has been trying to regulate the employment of cruise ship workers for a long time with not very much success. And so basically cruise ship companies can do whatever they like to these people.
That's right. And particularly once they've hooked up with contracts, and particularly once they're in debt, there's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy that they have to keep doing it for a certain time anyway. So there's numerous quotes there that we, from various, we did some work around blogging, that we've got some work from blogs, but also interviews as well. So, in terms of the kind of theoretical stuff we've been looking at in the course so far, we've kind of framed this up in a paper that we published around Bourdieuian ideas, around kind of symbolic violence, around, new forms of global cultural capitals, and in some work that I'm doing recently that's not published yet, I'm going to talk about in terms of choice and illusio and social gravity and some of those ideas that I was speaking about in earlier in the course. well, after we did this research too, we found that there was actually a whole kind of academic industry around the global.
Yeah, we did,
cruise
which we
ship
weren't aware of.
Yeah, so we did a kind of obvious literature research, and we kind of covered a lot of it, but we kind of started meeting people, and we actually had a seminar here where there were some other papers delivered about the cruise ship industry and the incredible waste that gets pours into the ocean.
Yeah.
But even probably more problematic, that was the incredible higher rates of sexual assault that goes on the boats. That are, again, completely, because they're in unregulated space out in the kind of, they're not attached to any country's laws, largely goes unpoliced. And it wasn't just kind of, it was often assaults between passengers and staff, but there was also lots of assaults between passengers and staff and staff. It just seemed to be kind of rampant on this total institution where people are trapped in these confined areas for such a long period of time.
It was Goffman's idea of the total institution, because you couldn't get off.
Yeah. So, I don't know, it's a kind of, again, earlier we were talking about, studying one social space to find out various other things about social relations and the way things work, and looking at the cruise ship as a space and as an industry kind of draws out a lot of those things as well.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah. Okay, so just to conclude the lecture, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the work you're currently doing in the forthcoming book that's coming out with Routledge next year. Yeah. You want to just kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
I guess I decided to write this book. I've worked a lot with Muslim youth, and part of this research is set in the West, not in Indonesia. This book I'm working. So Muslim youth and the diaspora of the West, of various ethnic groups who now live in the West. And following 9/11 and the Bali bombing and a whole lot of other terrorist activities, Muslim youth were suddenly suspected of being possible future terrorists. And they were also, there was a moral panic around the idea that they might become radicalised and turn into your local homegrown terrorist and blow up.
Which is ongoing. It's happening in the newspaper
it happens every day. And I was kind of used to that and used to think, oh, goodness, they don't really understand, the federal government really doesn't understand the situation with Muslim youth at all. I mean, because they're youth, first and foremost. Why don't they just look at them as youth?
Well, yeah.
Well,
you would also say that the federal government doesn't understand young people either.
Well,
so
they
there's
don't.
Kind of
so therefore, it's a combined misunderstanding. And then I read a federal government announcement that it would start a think tank to create counter-narratives to Islamist extremism that would find a way of disseminating to youth. And I was so appalled at this, at how out of touch it is with young people, that I decided at that moment to write the book about the counter-narratives to Islamist extremism that young Muslims themselves generate all the time.
So you can see there in the government discourse about creating counter-narratives, this is almost implicit in that as the young people are cultural dupes. That
it is.
The total product of what they're fed and given, and they'd have no kind of agency or struggle for themselves to think for themselves. And we need to kind of discipline them and inculcate them with this information to stop them doing something bad.
So they won't be brainwashed by them. We're going to brainwash them with something else. And any top-down thing like that is always manifestly unsuccessful. Everything they've tried to do with young people, no matter what bad things they appear to be doing, doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I decided to really start to document that. And so I looked at the Islamist meta-narrative, as I call it, which is a fairly hard line. We are the Muslims. We will rule the world. We will create a caliphate. Everyone will convert to Islam. We'll all live happily ever after. There's going to be a big battle, and we're going to win it.
So the Andrew Bolt version of
Andrew Bolt.
Muslim,
So that is also exactly what Al Qaeda and Islamic State and Osama bin Laden and all the rest of them, and the new guy Baghdadi who's announced himself as the caliph, the new caliph of the new caliphate. They all say the same thing. So in other words, what Andrew Bolt thinks every Muslim in Australia is thinking is based on what's coming from the hardliners and the actual jihadis. And so I decided I would do this around popular culture, because it's in popular culture that you see many of the really kind of creative and interesting counter-narratives that young Muslims in Australia and elsewhere in the diaspora in other Western countries create. For themselves, out of their own collective creativity. So I started using Paul Willis, cultural, what's it called? Common culture. Common culture. I also used Judith Butler's idea of, in order to create a counter-narrative about anything, you use the tools of resistance where they fall. In other words, you use what's in and around you to create the counter-narrative of anything.
Yep.
And also the post-structuralist idea that young people position themselves within different discourses.
Yep.
In fact, I've just been writing a conclusion to a chapter before I came to this lecture. And in that, I'm looking at the absolute multitude and diversity of Muslim websites that young people might log on to.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from the coming apocalypse to the end of days to, can I kiss my girlfriend, and online Muslim dating sites,
right,
and also the hardline sites and darknet and everywhere.
Yep.
In a way, the sheer diversity of all these websites, each telling a different story, is in itself a vast counter-narrative to that narrow hardline thing. It constitutes a counter-narrative of its own simply in the massive diversity of it. So wherever you go, in fact, even if you're looking for a ruling on something, if you're a young Muslim and say, is it all right to listen to rock music? You can find 10 different opinions that will tell you completely different things on the net from established and authoritative sources. Every ethnic group in the diaspora that's a Muslim group like the Turks or the Sudanese or whatever have their own sites. And I can only speak 3 languages. I mean, I can't speak Arabic or Turkish, which means my ability to get onto a lot of this stuff is very, I can't read Arabic or Turkish. So it's a very fascinating topic, and that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Okay. So can tell me a little bit about the gender stuff that you're writing about.
The gender stuff. Well, there's a belief that, that Muslim girls are just very sheltered, that they have no agency in how they usually get constructed. They're either victims of patriarchy, victims of oppression, that they're forced to wear the headscarf, that they're this and that and other things. They're very meek and mild, and all they want to do is get married and be good little girls and all that sort of stuff. And this is really not true. I mean, in the first place, there's a lot in the Quran. I have read the Quran. I felt it was really necessary to do that. In his own way, Muhammad was a real kind of his time. He was ahead of his time. I mean, he gave rights to women that they didn't have in the regimes that he was, in existing regimes. Much of the sort of oppressive stuff to do with women comes out of the hadiths, which are the not regarded as authoritative a text, depends who you talk to, but as the Quran. The Quran itself has a lot in it. It's like the Bible. It's full of good things and bad things. And a lot of Muslim women who are quite feminist in their orientation read the Quran differently. Because you can read the Bible for a feminist reading, you can also do that with the Quran. And what I've found looking at young Muslims and their generation of counter-narratives, young Muslim women, was that they're on all the websites. They're commenting all the time. They're not absent from these comments on jihad or comments on what you should and shouldn't be doing, or the Islamist meta-narrative of supporting it or opposing it. Because the internet is not a gender-segregated place.
So the internet affords them
it affords them a total freedom to go to any website and comment on anything. The other thing they do is through music. I haven't written the chapter on music yet, but there's a lot of young women just performing their own stuff and uploading it to YouTube and getting famous overnight. And the whole social media thing enables a particular celebrity profile even to emerge of who they are and what they're saying. With gender, there's this kind of romantic idea of rushing off and marrying a jihadi. And then there's other women saying, and then there's a whole sort of contested thing even within the jihadi sites, because women are quite favoured as suicide bombers and as jihadis because they can pass through all kinds of things and nobody suspects them. But then if you've got to be a jihadi, you have to be a martyr. And so the theological question is, can women be a martyr? And if they go to heaven, what is the female reward equivalent up there? So this is very contested. And women are right in there arguing this out. So when you look at the counter-narratives, or, it's like a lot of the gender regulations that keeps men and women very unmarried or unrelated Muslim men and women in actual reality, physical space separated, doesn't occur on the internet. So it's a really interesting study.
Okay. What about you was mentioning a little bit about the stereotypes. What do you think this work you're doing will kind of contribute to the stereotypes that we're talking about in terms of governmental stuff?
Well, in terms of governmental stuff, it gets back to what I said in the first place, that these young people are young people. They might be Muslim young people, but they are young people. Their preoccupations are exactly those of other young people.
Yep.
They want to be cool. They want to have legitimacy with their friends.
Yep.
They want to fit into their social scenes.
Yep.
They feel their families don't understand them.
Mm-hmm.
They want to find a nice partner eventually and get married and have kids and have a good job.
Yep.
And they also want to be good Muslims.
Yep.
Just like Christian youth want
Yep.
all those things, and they also want to be good Christians.
Yep.
So they're not that unusual.
Yep.
There's nothing particularly unusual about them
Yep.
in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And so they must be dealt with as in terms of their generation and in terms of the preoccupations of young people.
Yep.
We need to see them as young people and not proto-terrorists.
Yep. Do you think realistically the moral panics and stereotypes around Muslims in a place like Australia at the moment can be countered and, more realistically dealt with in politics?
Well, no, I expect everyone will totally ignore my book because they normally
Well, I don't.
do. That's what you're getting at, Steve.
No, I don't mean your research specifically as if it's going to change the world. But I mean, where do you think this stuff is going to go at the moment? So it's in Australia now. We're talking today, with all kinds of refugee stuff going on and all this kind of thing. Can this stuff play out in a more positive way based on understanding, or do you think that's just a naive?
Well, I think
based on more understanding of other people's lives, or is that a naive position?
I think it's not a naive position. I wish it would happen that way.
Yep.
However, I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a differentiation within, which hasn't really happened yet, but we're going to see more and more identification of particular ethnic Muslim groups as being most problematic.
Yep. So you think the kind of moral panic and stereotyping will become more specific?
I think it'll become more ethnically specific,
right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. I don't want to be saying that, but I do believe that that's what will happen.
Yeah.
Because of what's going on in the rest of the world, basically.
Yep.
And the fact of the matter is that most of the attacks on Western soil at the moment of so-called Islamist terrorists, I'm not going to use Muslim terrorists because they're really Islamist terrorists, not Muslim terrorists. Islamist terrorists is more or less lone wolf or very small groups of people who choose to take particular actions. The attacks on police in wherever it was, in London, and then the attacks in Paris were small, tiny groups of people that weren't even affiliated with anything particular.
Yeah.
So,
other than in kind of an imagined online way.
The online stuff is very, very important, but it's not really like the huge octopus-like tentacles all over the planet sort of thing. It's not the Cold War. And it can't be dealt with like the Cold War. It's kind of an ideology that people pick up on and think, well, I'm going to go and do that for their own particular personal reasons.
Okay, so what's your next project going to be?
At the moment, I'm pretty caught up with this. I'm putting in for a large grant to really research Muslim youth in Australia. The book that I'm writing is on Muslim youth all over the world because I'm working with the internet, which means you talk to people and being in touch with people all over the planet. But I'm going to do a very concentrated study in Australia of how Muslim youth in Australia understand themselves. I'm going to recruit them through, and I'm going to look particularly at their creative dealing with the creative generation of a whole range of counter-narratives.
Okay.
Through music, through art, through community activism, through sporting clubs, through all kinds of stuff.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Steve.